So I'm going to turn all the lights back on, and we're going to start playing around with the materials. I'm going to get rid of the room for a moment, and we'll just focus on the chair. And then we'll add some more stuff in here. Okay. Okay, so here's our chair with the default material on it. And so with the default material, it just kind of reflects the light. It has some shadow, and depending on the lighting setup, we see kind of the different highlights and the different colors. And so what we can do is play with the material on this object. The object is actually this guy, this chair mesh here. And so the material determines how the mesh interacts with light. The default material is just kind of this like white color, and it's kind of diffuse, meaning that the light hits it and it just kind of spreads out. It doesn't reflect, it doesn't have any texture or anything else. And so with the material, we can change a lot of the visual components. The most obvious one is just the color, which we can either set to just a solid color, or we can set it to multiple colors using either textures or shaders. And then there's a million properties that kind of go along with that. So I'm just going to go over some of the sort of main properties that you might want to use, and then we'll also add some textures in as well. We're not actually going to create any shaders, but it's important to know the term shader. The shader is just the program that runs on the graphics processor that does all the calculations to apply the light to the material. So when we make a material, it has a built-in shader. You can write shaders yourself. There's a shader editor in Godot. And if you want to have a lot of like specific controls over the look of the material, you might start writing your own shaders. When I'm working on my projects, I tend to write my own shaders just because I can have a lot of sort of fine-tuned control over the exact look. But writing shader code is a bit challenging and kind of off topic, so we're not going to get into that. But it's important to just understand that a shader is a program that does all the calculations for the material. So materials have shaders, but we're just setting the properties through the material. We're not writing the code through the material. The textures are images that we add to the material to change the colors of the material, but also change different properties like how rough or reflective or other properties of the material that we'll look at. So let's just change some of the basics. So there's a few different places in Godot to set up a material. Materials in Blender also work pretty similarly, but they kind of have slightly different naming conventions and a different way of editing. We're not going to get too much into materials in Blender, but most of the time when you have a model that you download, if you edit it in Blender, the material should make it over to Godot and look pretty much the same. It's usually a pretty good adaptation. To add a material, there's a few places we can do it. So if you go to the geometry and add a material override, this is where it will go if you just drag a material from your file system onto the mesh. So if I take one of my default materials and throw it on here, you can see that it gets added to that material override. The material override only applies to this one instance of the mesh. But if we apply a material to this mesh property here, it'll apply to all instances of the mesh. So that what that means is if I duplicate the mesh, it'll keep the material. So let's just show that real quick. So if I add this here, that's the material override. If I duplicate this guy, it won't, we can take that material off. If I add a material here to the surface, it should, I forgot, this is a mesh from, we actually can't, I forgot we can't edit this because it's from Blender. So let's add let's just add a mesh in here real quick. So I'll just add a mesh instance. And let's make a little donut. And I'll just make this a little bit bigger. Okay. So let's do that again. So on my mesh, if I add in a material here, and I duplicate the mesh, it's going to have the same material. And then if I add a material override, so that will override this instance of the material. So if I throw this on here, you can see it changes that one. If I change the material here, it should change both of them. So yeah, you can see it changes both instances of the mesh. Of course, you can always make a unique mesh, so you can always undo that. But if you want all of your meshes to have the same material, you can add them in this material property, and then when you duplicate them, they'll all have the same material. And then, of course, you can override that material if you want to. So there's a few different ways to add the material. It kind of depends on your workflow. There's also a material overlay. So that sounds similar, but that's going to overlay a second material on top of the original material, and you can change how that works together. That gets a little complicated, so let's not do that just yet. So let's get rid of these guys. And let's grab this chair. I'm gonna get rid of the, oh, I can't get rid of that one. Okay, let's get rid of that one. Okay, so let's go back to our chair mesh, and we'll clear this material, and we'll create our own material. So when you create a material on the object here, it makes a material that's embedded in the instance of the object. And so you can't apply the material to other things, but you can save the material and then apply it to other things. So a lot of the time, if you're working on a project, if you have a bunch of copies of a mesh, you'll want to work on the main material in here. You can't do that on a Blender mesh, but if you do it on a regular mesh, you can. But if you do edit a material override, you can always make a copy of that and save it into the file system like you would a level or a scene, and then you can apply that to other things. So we'll see an example of that in a second. I'll put an extra chair over here just in case. All right, so let's grab our chair and we'll create a new material. So if I click empty, you can see I have a few options. So the standard material is a material that's default to Godot, where I can set all the properties to whatever I want. The shader material is if I just want to write a shader from scratch. We're not going to do that, but if you wanted to, you could do that. You could also, if you see a shader code example that you want to use somewhere, you could plug it in here. So let's make a new material. So the default, we still get that white color. And if we click on the material, we open all these options. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So you can see there's a ton of different properties. And there's only a few properties that we're going to look at in depth because there's too many to cover all of them. But there's a lot of different things that you can change. So you might want to think about other things that you might want to change about your material. The main thing that you'll probably want to change is the color. This is in material language is called the albedo. And we can set the albedo using either just a basic color or a texture. So if we set it to a color, it's going to apply across the entire material. So if I want this chair to be, blue or pink or whatever, I can set that color to the entire material. Notice that it's going to interact with the lights. So because my lights have colors, they, sort of multiply together with the color of the material. So there's this green highlight over here. And so if I have kind of a pink material, it's still kind of green over here. So the resulting color is going to be the product of the lighting setup and the color in the material. We'll come back when we add some textures in a moment, but we can add textures in here. So that's the albedo. That's kind of the main thing you might want to change if you just want to change some colors. And so we have this color here. If we go back up here, we can see there's transparency, so you can actually make the materials transparent. If you were making like a window or something like that, that might be useful. This is pretty processor intensive, so I don't recommend doing this unless you really need to. but we can add alpha to the material, and now you can see through the material. This is gonna look kind of weird, and part of the reason for that is because I haven't unwrapped the mesh. We will talk about that when we go into textures in a little bit. So we're gonna leave the transparency off. We can also change the blend mode. This is something that you're probably also not gonna really wanna play with unless you're doing some really crazy stylistic thing. But let's turn our room back on for a second, and then you'll see if I change the blend mode, if I change this to add, see how it adds the color of the material to whatever's behind it. So that might be useful if you want to make like a weird ghost effect or something like that. But most of the time you wouldn't really use that. If you do subtract, it's going to do this inversion of whatever's behind it. Again, might be useful for like if you're doing like a ghost hunter game or something like that. You can multiply, and you can do pre-multiplied alpha. We don't want to do that. So normally you just leave this alone. There's also a cull mode setting. We'll look at this a little bit more in a little bit, but you can change this to disabled or front or back. The default is just that you're going to see the outside of the material or the mesh. If we change it to front, you can see what we're seeing is actually kind of the inside of the geometry. Again, you don't normally want to do that unless you have some kind of weird cutout thing, but normally we just want to leave this the same. So most likely you won't play with these properties, but you may want to, if you have like a specific look that you're going for, they might be useful. We're not going to play with the shading stuff here, but the one thing that you might want to do here is if you're doing a stylized look, you can set this to tune. When you do a tune shader, it still uses the light, but it applies it in sort of blocks of color. So it looks more stylized. It's kind of more like the Overwatch or Fortnite style rather than the more realistic style. So tune shader could be useful if you're doing a stylized look across, your whole project. It's, a specific look. The rest of these are kind of like different algorithms for deciding how to apply the light. And we don't really need to worry about that too much. We can also turn off the ambient light and the fog here if we want to. I don't have those on right now, so it doesn't, or I do have the ambient light. So if I turn off the ambient light, you can see there's just sort of more extreme lighting involved or on this mesh. All right, so some other properties that you might want to set for different types of materials are metallic and roughness. So metallic is basically how shiny. And so if we turn the metallic value up a lot, right now it still kind of looks the same, but there's this sort of interaction between the metallic and the roughness and the specular properties that can create different amounts of shininess. So I'm going to reset these defaults for a second. Go to roughness. So the roughness is all the way up. So if I turn the roughness all the way down, now you can see it looks more shiny and more plasticky. And now if I go back to the metal, when I turn the metal back up, the metallic back up, we start to see more of that metal effect.
The
so
gold chair, mister.
What?
The gold chair.
Yeah, it looks like a golden, yeah. So if you want like stuff that looks kind of reflective or like water or like metal, you want to add this metallic look. And it's always the thing that's a little tricky with metallic and roughness is that they're really related to each other. So notice when I have roughness set to 1, it doesn't really change the look very much to change the metallic. It makes it look darker, but it doesn't make it look shinier. When I set the roughness down to 0, suddenly it has this very extreme effect where we get these really extreme highlights and reflections. And then if we change the specular values, you can see we get sort of different combinations of stuff. So depending on what you're going for, you might want to play around with some of that stuff. You can get, different looks like plastic or metal or different things. Yeah, let's set these back to the defaults and we'll look at a couple other things. So emission is when an object emits light. So most of the time our light comes from lights, but our light can come from materials. So if I turn on emission, right now the default is set to black, so we don't see anything. But if I change this to a bright color, now our model is actually emitting light. And so this light will affect the rest of the scene as well. So if I change this color, it'll make the object look a certain way, but it's also going to reflect on other objects around it, especially if I turn up the energy. You can see now that pink glow is affecting the room and other objects around. So normally, most objects don't glow, but some objects do glow. Like if you have like a light that you're modeling, if you have some like special object that you want to glow, you can do that. And then you can do either add or multiply. Add is just going to add the light on top. Multiply is going to multiply the lights together. So you're going to get a more varied look. Most of the time you just want add. So that's emission. There's also a bunch of other stuff here that are more sort of subtle effects. If we look at like ambient occlusion is a good example of this. Ambient occlusion is this kind of weird physical property where if two things are really close together, they kind of reflect shadows on each other. And so if you turn this on, you'll see that like the corners and edges of things are going to look a little bit different. And this is going to look more, this is going to theoretically make things look more realistic. It's not always that noticeable. It's kind of hard to, we don't really see it here. It would probably be more noticeable on the room texture or the room mesh. Let's see, do I have a material on here? It's not even that visible here. If I had a more complex geometry, I think it would be easier to demonstrate this, but it's a pretty subtle effect, so I think for now we'll just move on. All right. These other properties like rim, clear code, subsurface scattering, these are for like very, very detailed, really specific effects. So I won't get into those now, but if you see stuff like that you want to use, you might see in different shader examples, you can go over it. Let's see, there's, we can change some of the shadows so we can receive shadows on the material. We don't need to do that right now. I think that's those are kind of most of the main things that you'll really want to play with is basically the color, the roughness, and metallic and emission. What we'll do now is get into some textures. And so we can add textures in a lot of different ways that will have different effects on the scene. Textures are images. We can actually make textures inside of Godot, but I don't really recommend this because it gets kind of confusing. But we're going to look for textures online, and we can also make textures in Photoshop. Actually, before I get into that, one thing I mentioned earlier is so if we have this material and you're like, okay, I really like this cool orange material, I want to apply it to other stuff in my scene. And it could be other chairs, but it could be other objects, whatever. Right now, the material only exists inside this instance, but there's a drop down here, and if I save the material, then I can save it in my file system and apply it to other things. So I can save this, and I want to go into my materials folder, and I'll say, cool orange material. And so now you see that cool orange material. If I throw this on my other chair, I get that same material there. And you can, if I make edits to this material, it'll update in both places. So I can change the material and, it'll affect other instances of the material. Okay, so let's add some textures. So if you go online, if you search like textures 3D, you'll see that a lot of people just make textures that you can use for free. A lot of Creative Commons and public domain textures. If you search on Google, I recommend going to Creative Commons. This will kind of restrict things a little bit, but you'll see stuff that people created for you to use. And there's going to be all sorts of different stuff. So depending on what you're looking for, like if you wanted like a grass texture to use on your ground, you can, add grass there, and then you'll see lots of different textures. So something like this you could apply to a ground, and you'll have that sort of texture on the ground.
Downside, I think with DeviantArt, I think you do need an account to download things off of.
Yeah, a lot of these services kind of make you log in or add different things that you have to do.
It used to not be like.
Well, M-A... Ambient CG. Okay, yes.
And they have their. And cool, they have their license clearly on their.
Cool. Yeah, so if you wanted like a brick wall, we could download this. And this is kind of similar to when we were looking at the models. Notice that it shows you a lot of different options. So 1K means that the material image is 1024 by 1024. And you can see it's 5 megabytes, which is kind of crazy for a 1K image, but there's a lot of detail in this image. The more colors and details it is, the larger the image is going to be.
That PNG, the 8K PNG, damn.
Yeah, so yeah, this one is half a gigabyte. Is kind of wild, but a lot of games that are really, really high-end rendering have really crazy materials or textures in them, and that's part of what makes them look so good. Let's download this little one and just see what's in there, because I think it'll be interesting to look at. So I just downloaded that brick texture, and if we look in here, yeah, so you can see this is the color material. Oh, it's sort of an interesting shape. Usually they're square. It's funny that this is a rectangle. They're almost always square, but that's fine, whatever. Let's look at it. Okay. Yeah, it's 1024 by 512. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, so that's the color. So that's what would go in the albedo. But there's a couple other things in here. There's a displacement map. There's a normal map. There's a normal GL map, and there's a roughness map. And so all of these things correspond with different parts of our material in the ways that they interact with light. So why don't we let's go ahead and use this since we downloaded it. So I'm gonna throw this into my project. Here's my textures folder. So you can see it has these default grid textures that I included in the default project. I'll throw this bricks texture in here. And let's go back to Godot. And let's add a wall in here. I'll hide the room for a second. So I'm going to add a mesh instance. And I'll call this wall. And I'll just make a big plane. And let's see. I'll make it really big. And then I'll turn it up like this. Okay. And so we can see some of the lights and our lighting in our scene. Okay. So for this one, I'll add a new material. I'll go to the material override and make a new standard material. And then it is kind of interesting. It's honestly a little odd to me that this is a rectangle and not a square. These textures are almost always squares, but we'll just go with it. So, okay, we open our material. So the albedo is the color. So sometimes it'll be named different things, but if we go into the materials, or no, I put it in textures. Here's my bricks. And here's this bricks 1K JPEG. And if I throw that onto the texture, you can see the bricks there. And it looks kind of weird because my mesh is square. So let's make the mesh the same resolution as the material. So now my mesh is twice as wide as is tall. I'm going to do a few other examples of this in a moment with our chairs, but let's just go with this for now since I think this is a good example. So now we have the material, we have the colors and the tech and the details, but it doesn't really look that real. It looks very flat. So even though it's a nice image and it's very high res, it looks very flat, and that's because it's not interacting with the lighting. So that's what those other things are for. And so if we go to, let's start with the height map. So sometimes these things use different names, but displacement and height are essentially the same thing. This is like the relative height of the texture, and so it'll interact with the light to create shadows. And the way these images work is they use color to encode data. So if we look at the displacement map here, in this case, things that are white are going to be higher, and things that are dark are going to be lower. And so we're going to create this kind of like distance. And so we're basically using image textures as sort of simple data formats. So if I throw this displacement map in my height texture, it's kind of subtle, but can you guys kind of see how, look at this like dip right here in between the bricks. Notice that actually seems to be a little more 3D now. It's interacting with the light a little bit differently. So it's actually moving it behind. And so what textures do with these materials is it adds a level of detail that would be too much. If we wanted to do this with a mesh, we'd need like a million little mesh points. But with the texture, we can just kind of manipulate the color to make it look 3D. So we can really, this is actually a pretty good example. I think I thought the brick would be a good example of this, and it is. You can see how this brick right here really looks like it's like receding from the rest of the wall. When you get really close, you start to see it's pretty goofy looking. But from far away, if you're just walking by, it's a pretty good effect. You can also change the scale of this. So if I scale this down to 0, notice that, or no, I went too far. So if I go to 0, we're back to just flat. If I scale it up, we're kind of moving away. If I scale it the other way, it just goes in the other direction. So the default is 5. I would probably do something a little more subtle, like 2 here, so it's not as goofy looking. But yeah, that's the basic idea of the texture map. And so obviously that texture map goes along with the albedo, but it doesn't have to. Like if we took this texture off the albedo, we would still get some effects. We don't see it right now because it's all the same color. So we would need a little bit more detail there. But it should correspond with the albedo. Okay, let's put that back on. I'm going to turn the height map off for a second, and we'll look at a couple other things. So there's the normal map, and you can see there's normal DX and normal GL. I actually don't know what the difference between those is. That's probably just different rendering systems like WebGL and whatever DX is. The WebGL one looks better to me. This is the same thing, but instead of black and white, we're just using a wider color gamut. So the normals are the directions that the parts of the mesh are facing. And so if something's facing a different direction, it's going to interact with light differently. Things that are facing more up are those little green things. Those are going to be highlighted because the light is hitting them more directly. Things that are blue or darker are facing down, so they're going to be less illuminated because the light isn't affecting them as much. So if I turn on the normal map and I throw, let's do our normal GL in here. See how it adds highlights and shadows? And again, if I scale this down to 0, it doesn't do anything. But if I scale it up, you can see the highlights and the shadows. And so the normal map, again, works with the albedo to emphasize that texture and make it more realistic. So it looks a lot more 3D than it did before. Okay, let's turn this off for a second. We'll turn them all on at the end. There's one more map we have in here. This is the roughness map. And so roughness map is how reflective it is, sort of like the metallic and roughness that we looked at earlier. So if I throw this roughness map in here, what it's going to do is that certain parts of our brick are rougher. They diffuse light more. Certain parts are more shiny. The brick is all pretty rough, so I don't really see a huge difference here, but let's turn it down and then see what happens. So if I turn this to 0, okay, so you can see there's certain parts of the brick that reflect light and are a little bit more shiny. Oh, I might need to change this to gray. No, that didn't do anything. Okay. There's also, they have a channel, so sometimes you can use different colors to represent different data. But yeah, that's the basic idea. Let's throw all of these in here and see if it looks good or if it looks totally ridiculous. Okay. So it looks a little over the top. Like it's sort of a little bit too much, but it does look more 3D. It does look more like quote unquote real. So this is more of a photorealistic look. So again, these things are useful if you want something that looks photorealistic, if you want a lot of detail and texture. If you don't really care that much, you know, you don't really need to sort of use this stuff. And obviously the more of this stuff that you add into your scene, again, the more performance hit you're gonna take. So let's look at making some of our own textures. I'm gonna turn off the wall for a second and we'll look at the chair again. Okay, so let's look at the chair and let's make some of our own textures. We'll just make some simple stuff. So I'm gonna use Photoshop to do this, but you can really do it in pretty much any program. I'll show you guys just a few things that I like to do. So I'm gonna make a new file. You basically want a square file. Square is gonna be easier to work with. Default might be 1024 by 1024. It depends on how much detail you want. I'm gonna do 512 by 512 just to kind of save a little bit of space. But I'll just make this square and then you can kind of put whatever you want on here. So one of the easiest ways to make like a really basic texture that just adds a little bit of grain or, you know, feel to it is just noise. If you just do add noise, you know, you can just add some noise. You can make it black and white or multicolor, and then you can change the amount. If you do a lot of noise, it's going to be kind of crunchy and pixelated. If you do a small amount of noise, it'll be more subtle. I usually like to do like maybe like 12, something like that. This is really subtle, but it'll just add a little bit of grain to the material. Even something very, very simple like this will make it look a lot more realistic. So I'm going to save this. Or no, I don't even want to save this. I'm just going to export this. But before I do that, there's a bunch of other things you can do in Photoshop. So I just did noise. That's really simple. But if you go to Filter Gallery and look under Texture, there's a bunch of other stuff you can do where you don't even need an image. You can just start with a white background. And so like you can add grain, that's basically noise, mosaic, patchwork, and you can kind of play around with these things. Stained glass, you can, you know, do stuff, and they all have a lot of different settings. So like this basic texture, maybe you want like a t-shirt or a quilt or something. You can play with, you know, all these different settings. Maybe you want brick, whatever. So it's really easy to actually make your own textures. And then you can use these for normal maps and stuff as well. Oh, there's our daily projector malfunction.
All right, I'm on it. If you can just hit the off button.
Yeah.
That way we don't accidentally burn it up.
All right,